Kia ora, Grace City. Great to be with you again. Isn't it great being in church and seeing gorgeous Christmas trees and starting to sing carols and really engaging in the season? I've been singing carols since October, but for the rest of you to join me is absolutely brilliant. But I wonder if you listen closely to the words that we are actually singing in this season. For instance, we just sung this morning, "O come all ye faithful." O come all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. O come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of angels. Over at East this morning, they're singing, "Hark the herald angels sing." This is the second verse of that carol. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time, behold him come, offspring of the Virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail, incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus, our Emmanuel. Or another well-known carol, "Angels from the realms of glory, wing your flight over all the earth. You who sang creation's story, now proclaim Messiah's birth." And I could keep going on and on and on. But the reality is that if we're really honest, the Christmas story has some really out there elements to it, doesn't it? I mean, angel choirs, moving stars, mysterious magi, angel announcements, a virgin birth. And is it really, honestly, a little bit unbelievable? That's kind of what the series that we're in for this Christmas season is exploring. Is this Christmas story just a little bit too out there to be believable? Some of the issues are around, is Jesus even a historical person, which is what Adam Clausen walked us through last week. JD's going to be here in a couple of weeks to talk about the virgin birth, and does that make any sense? But today, I want to ponder the other question that was in that promo. Is the Christmas story historically true? Like, as we come to the Christmas story, as we read about it in the Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, is that historically true? Can we believe this story as it's been passed down to us? Or is it, as we would have started to say in the last decade or so, is the Christmas story just fake news? Is it legend? Is it myth? Is it simply unbelievable? Well, the truth is there's a lot of skeptics out there who say it is completely unbelievable. It's something that we cannot believe in. One of the skeptics I've loved to quote over the years is an Anglican bishop, which is a little surprise given the role, but Anglican bishop in America by the name of John Shelby Spong. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he wrote a bunch of books that I love quoting from. Here's what he once wrote. He said, "Was Jesus born in Bethlehem, the city of David? The answer is a simple no. There is almost no possibility that this claim is a fact of history." Is the Christmas story historically true? Bishop Spong says absolutely not. It is fake news. And what I want to do in this message is I want to take the claims of people like Bishop Spong and I want to pull them apart a little bit, because I want to look at 4 key claims or issues that people like Spong raise, and I want to respond to those and help us think about the evidence for the fact that actually we can trust this amazing story of what happened at that first Christmas. So 4 problems, 4 issues. The first problem I want to talk about is what I want to call the telephone game problem. The telephone game problem. So the key question here is, didn't the real story get distorted as it was shared through the years? So the telephone game is that kids' game that they sometimes play at birthday parties where they generally sit in a circle, and it's been known by another name through the years that has got really racist overtones that I don't like. But in America, it's called the telephone game, so I'm going with that. But kids sit in a circle, and the first child begins, and they whisper a sentence or a phrase to the child next to them, and then they whisper to the next one, and it goes round the circle until the last child then says out loud what they heard. And the whole point is, by the time it's gone around the circle, the story, the message, the sentence, whatever it is, has been so distorted and stuffed up, it's hilarious. You know, the more messed up it is, the more fun the game is. That's how the telephone game works. But it's often used as an analogy for what happened to the stories of Jesus. So, for example, one of the leading skeptics in our world today is a professor in the US called Bart Ehrman. So he writes this: "What do you suppose happened to the stories about Jesus over the years? as they were told and retold, not as disinterested news stories reported by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith, told by people who themselves had heard them 5th or 6th or 19th hand. Didn't you or your kids ever play the telephone game at a birthday party? So notice what Bart Ehrman is alleging. He's alleging that basically what happened with the earliest followers of Jesus is basically the telephone game where the message gets repeated so often and so many times, by the time it's gone around the circle, it's utterly different to really how it started out. But I think the analogy completely breaks down, and for a number of reasons. First of all, in the telephone game, it begins with a single source. It's one person saying a sentence to kick things off. The truth is that in the earliest history of the followers of Jesus, it wasn't one person kicking this thing off. It was a stackload of people who were eyewitnesses to what Jesus had said and done. So it wasn't just a single source that was being corrupted. There were multiple people, hundreds of people, immediately sharing the message of Jesus. And what that means is if one person had begun to distort the message, there's a truckload of other people who are sharing the real story, and it could immediately be verified. And that leads us to another problem with this analogy that Professor Ehrman comes up with. The problem in the telephone game is that if you're child number 7 and you get a message whispered in your ear that's utterly garbled, what you're not allowed to do is stand up and walk over to child number 1 and say, hey, can you tell me what the message was? Because whatever I've heard is a load of rubbish. If you ever do that in the telephone game, you're going to ruin it for everyone. That's not how the game works. But that's exactly how it worked in the early church. You could go and verify the news. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, which we're going to come back to again in a little bit, 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul is writing in about 53 to 55 AD, and he's writing about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and he's talking about the fact that the resurrected Jesus appeared to all of these different people, and then he says, and at one point he appeared to over 500, some of whom have died, but most of them are still alive. 23, 25 years after the death of Jesus. What's Paul saying? He's saying, if you don't believe me or you're unsure, there's hundreds of people you can go chat to who actually saw Jesus with their own eyes. You can go back to the source of the story and check out if it's real or not. But the biggest problem I have with this so-called problem, the telephone game problem, isn't the story fake news because it got distorted, is the analogy completely breaks down because the whole point of the telephone game is to distort the message. The entire intention of the earliest followers of Jesus was to do the exact opposite. It was to pass on carefully the truth about who Jesus is. The telephone game is actually a horrible analogy for what the earliest of followers of Jesus did, because the whole point of that game is to distort the truth, not pass it on. And that was the intention of these earliest followers of Jesus. And we see that in a number of places, but I in particular want to direct us to the Gospel of Luke, because out of the 4 biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that we have in the Bible, it's Luke and Matthew that tell us the Christmas story. So here's how Luke begins his gospel. This is how he starts off his introduction. Luke 1 verse 1. He writes, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So a number of people have written the story, he says, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So notice what Luke is saying. Luke is very careful to say, I'm not an eyewitness. I didn't meet Jesus when he was on earth. I didn't get to hear him. But there were eyewitnesses. And that's a key thing for Luke. Luke has gone and he's talked to those who saw Jesus and heard Jesus and had breakfast with Jesus and hung out with Jesus. And then he goes on and says this in verse 3, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, who was his patron, sponsoring his book, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught, See what Luke is saying? He said, I'm not an eyewitness, but I went and talked to the eyewitnesses. I carefully investigated like a good investigative journalist. I checked out the whole story. I made sure I chatted to the people who'd been really there. I probed the story to make sure it's real. And now I've carefully written this down. Why? So that Theophilus, you could be sure. See, this isn't the telephone game, folks. This is intentionally passing on the stories of Jesus accurately as real history. The other gospel that tells us the Christmas story, Matthew, it doesn't begin with a fancy introduction the way that Luke does. This is high kind of writing. Matthew doesn't start that way. Instead, Matthew starts with a genealogy. It's really exciting when you begin reading the New Testament to hit a family tree straight away. But there's an intention behind what Matthew's doing. Listen to the words of the late Tim Keller. This is what he writes. Matthew doesn't begin his story of Jesus' birth by saying, once upon a time. That's the way fairy tales and legends and myths and Star Wars begin. Matthew says, this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. That means he is grounding what Jesus is and does in history. Jesus isn't a metaphor. Jesus is real. This all happened. So did the real story get distorted over time? No, the real story about Jesus was passed down to us by those who had seen it. So the telephone game problem is not a problem at all. But the second problem that goes with this so-called problem, another one that kind of is attached to it a lot of the time, is what I want to call this morning the father time problem. The problem of time, basically. And the question behind that one is this: isn't the time lag too long between the events of Jesus' life and when the Gospels were written? Isn't that time lag too long? So, for example, one writer, Karen Armstrong, she writes this: we know, according to her, we know very little about Jesus. The first full-length account of his life was St. Mark's Gospel, which was not written until about the year 70, some 40 years after his death. And by that time, the historical facts had been overlaid by mythical elements. I'm going to come back to the mythical elements comment shortly with problem number 3. But basically what she's saying is the big problem is this time lag. You have Jesus' ministry, and his birth was even earlier, obviously, 30 or so years earlier. And then you've got this time lag to when the Gospels were written. And that's a major problem. And I want to respond to that with 3 different comments. Number 1 is, let's come back to this comment about the eyewitnesses. It actually doesn't matter if it was a 40-year time lag, which I'm about to disagree with. Even if it was a 40-year time lag, though, the Gospels are based on people who actually saw and heard what Jesus did. And so if they have remembered what Jesus said and did, then it's no problem. Now, she says Mark's Gospel was written 40 years before. I think it's a shorter time frame than that, but let's go with 40 years. I'm in my mid-50s. If I go back 40 years, I'm back into my teenage years. Do I remember everything that happened every day of my teenage years? No. Do I remember the most significant moments of my teenage years? Absolutely. Are they like memories seared into my mind that I can remember clearly and go back to? Absolutely. It's actually not a problem to remember accurately something that happened many years ago if it was something life-changing that dynamically changed your life. And that is why the New Testament keeps emphasizing this idea of eyewitnesses. That's why Luke writes, these were handed down to us by those who were from the first eyewitnesses. Peter will say in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 10, we are witnesses of everything that Jesus did in the country of the Jews and the Gentiles. So even if there was a long time lag, let's say 40 years, these are still eyewitnesses. And they're eyewitnesses who would remember things in an oral culture, not a written culture. Why is that significant? Well, we live in a written culture, so we don't have to rely on our memories as much. But Jesus and his earliest followers lived in an oral culture where there was writing, but generally things were passed down orally, which meant their memorization skills and techniques were far more advanced than what ours are today. In fact, I've just been reading a book recently by one of my favorite Christian authors, John Mark Comer. And in that book, John Mark Comer is talking about the disciples of Jesus and the fact that they were educated until they were 12 years old Jewish boys in a synagogue school, a school that was attached to the local synagogue in each town. And so little Jewish boys would go to synagogue school until they hit 12 or 13, their bar mitzvah, and then they would learn a trade, generally the trade of their dad. But what John Mark Comer says in this book is that a little Jewish boy at 12 years old has memorized, get this, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy off by heart. I struggle to get to Genesis 1 verse 2. They learnt the first 5 books of the Bible off by heart by the time they were 12 years old. Because this is an oral culture built on memorization. So do you think we can trust their memories when their memories are so well trained? Would they have remembered the sayings of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and the key moments of Jesus' life? You bet your bottom dollar they would have. This is eyewitnesses who remembered the most significant events of their lives because they had trained their minds to remember things particularly well. And the bottom line is I actually reject the size of the time gap that Karen Armstrong is trying to push anyway. That's the general time frames offered by skeptics. But the reality is there's strong evidence for the time lag being shorter. In fact, there's one scholar by the name of Peter Williams in Great Britain. And Peter Williams has suggested when you carefully read the Gospels, there are multiple small descriptions of geography and botany and coinage and customs and names and language and all kinds of things that suggest that the Gospels are written early. So he writes these words. He says, we might put it like this: the 4 Gospels are so influenced by Judaism in their outlook, subject matter, and detail that it would be reasonable to date them considerably before the Jewish War. The Jewish War is when the Romans had to reconquer Jerusalem in 66 to 70 AD, about the time Karen Armstrong says Mark's Gospel was written. What Peter Williams is saying is when you read this, when you read these Gospels carefully, these are written by people who understood the culture and the geography and the plant life and the coinage in a way they understood this well before Jerusalem was destroyed. See, it's kind of like, let's imagine I decided I'm going to write a novel. And I love the movie Casablanca. If you've ever seen that, Casablanca's awesome. Here's looking at you, kid. So I'm going to set my novel in Morocco. And now I can't afford to fly to Morocco, but I'm gonna research that. I mean, we live in an internet age, so I can jump on Wikipedia and find out all about Morocco and find out about the different places there. And I can even find cool photographs to get a sense of what the towns look like and stuff. And so I write my novel based in Morocco. Awesome. And then you read my novel, and you happen to have lived in Morocco for 20 years. You know Morocco by the back of your hand. I bet your bottom dollar that if you have lived in Morocco for a significant period of time, you would read my novel and you would go, yeah, you kind of know Morocco, but you don't know Morocco. You actually haven't been there, have you, Brad? You haven't walked those streets. You haven't sampled that coffee. You haven't been in Morocco. What Peter Williams is saying is you read the Gospels carefully. They were there. And they were there before the war of 66 to 70 AD. And that's why more scholars who believe in the integrity of the Bible date the Gospels earlier. So we're going to chuck up the timeline here that Adam Clausen used last week in his sermon, if you were here. It's slightly simplified. I dropped the dudes like Clement off the end to make it a little bit more simple. But notice the dates that Adam Clausen gave us for the Gospel writings. He's dating Mark at the top there, 50 to 60 AD, in the 50s. So now the time lag's down to 25 years. He's dating Matthew and Luke in the 60s. Only John is probably later. And in fact, I would even go even a little earlier on Luke than he has done. See, the Gospel of Luke is followed by the book of Acts, both of them written by Luke. And the book of Acts ends with the imprisonment of Paul, but it doesn't record Paul's getting out of that imprisonment, getting his freedom. So we date at the end of the book of Acts about 62 AD, and conservative scholars think that's when Luke probably wrote it. He wrote the book of Acts in 62 AD, and that's part 2. So I would date the book of Luke about 60 AD. Folks, this is pretty early. This is not a big time lag now at all. Even if it was 40 years, even if I granted that to Karen Armstrong, it's still not a problem. But the reality is, the Gospel of Mark's probably written 20 to 25 years after the events of Jesus' life and ministry. See, I don't think there's a telephone game problem, and I don't think there's a father time problem. But often mixed into those is another problem, a third problem skeptics raise, which I'm going to call the superhero problem. The superhero problem. And the question that goes with this is this: weren't the stories about Jesus exaggerated over time? In other words, didn't Jesus' followers make him into the superhero over time? They tell stories, and it's kind of like Steve over here who's just up here. He's a fisherman. And if you get Steve talking about the size of fish, now actually he's an honest fisherman. But if you talk to some fishermen, you know what's going to happen, eh? The week after that catch, the fish is about this big. By the time they're telling their grandkids about that fish, they hauled in this 2-meter shark. You know, that's how fishermen generally operate. Not Steve, but others. You know? And what this claim is saying is it's the same with Jesus' followers. To begin with, they just share about Jesus. But then over time, so let's go with the 40-year lag that Karen Armstrong wants to argue. She said the stories, the facts, got overlaid with mythical elements. So you would have heard the name probably of the atheist Richard Dawkins. This is the way Richard Dawkins writes about this. He says, everything that is in the Gospels suffered from decades of word-of-mouth retelling, distortion, and exaggeration before those 4 texts were finally written down. So that's the allegation. So wait a minute, you've got the ministry, the life of Jesus here, but by the time they get written, let's say 40 or more years, the story's just growing and growing and growing over time till you get these ridiculous claims by the time the Gospels are written. But there's an assumption in Richard Dawkins' claim that I'm going to challenge and I think blows the claim out of the water. And it's this: the biggest claim, the most audacious claim about Jesus that he's assuming has developed right towards the end here of that timeline. The biggest claim about Jesus is that he rose from the dead. And here's the problem for Richard Dawkins. The claim that Jesus rose from the dead happened within weeks of the crucifixion. Because within weeks of the crucifixion, his followers are standing up in the very city of Jerusalem where he was crucified by the Romans and saying, he is risen. They began to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus, which is the most audacious claim about him ever made. If it's all exaggeration, the biggest exaggeration is that Jesus rose from the dead. And that happened immediately after the death of Jesus. That didn't grow over time. And this is why the creeds are so important, that if you were here last week, Adam was talking about the creeds. So he took us to 1 Corinthians 15, if you remember. And I love the way he highlighted the rhythm of the creed that Paul quotes there in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. Jesus died according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He rose according to the Scriptures. He was seen. He died, he was buried, he rose, he was seen. There's this beautiful rhythm to this early creed that was memorized by the followers of Jesus. I want to take us back to that creed, but I want to highlight, in addition to what Adam said, I want to highlight the way Paul introduces that creed. Here's how he does it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received. We'll come back to those words. And on which you have taken your stand. Verse 3, for what I received, same word, I passed on to you as of first importance. Now the words I've highlighted here, the verbs received and passed on in the original Greek language, are actually technical words for the passing on of specific truths. See, what Paul is saying is, I received this creedal statement that I memorized, and when I came and preached to you, I passed that on and taught you this creed, and you received it. Now, most scholars believe that Paul came to faith in Jesus probably 2 years after the crucifixion, maybe 3. So within 2 to 3 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus, Paul has become a follower of Jesus. And it's as a new follower of Jesus, he received this creed. That's why if we go back to the timeline that Adam Clausen gave us last week, that's why you have the speeches up the top and the creed at the bottom, and they are dated within a year or 2 or 3 of the death of Jesus. And what this does, friends, is it blows this problem that Dawkins and others have, this superhero problem. Weren't the stories exaggerated over time? No. The story, the message was proclaimed right at the beginning. He is risen. There's no time for this exaggerated claim to grow. It was announced within weeks of the death of Jesus. So is there a telephone game problem? Was it distorted? No. Is there a time gap, a father time problem? No. Is there a superhero problem of exaggeration? No. The final claim, and these often are all wrapped up together, but the final claim I just want to consider briefly is what I want to call the conflicting report problem. The conflicting report problem. Aren't the stories about Jesus filled with huge contradictions? See, here's the way my friend Bishop Spong, this is the way he says it. Matthew and Luke lend support to the shakiness of Bethlehem. Bishop Spong has a big problem with Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And he says, Matthew and Luke, they lend support to the shakiness of that by disagreeing on how it was that Jesus happened to be there. Indeed, the two accounts vary in many places. In other words, here's what Bishop Spong is saying. You can't believe Matthew and Luke's accounts of the birth of Jesus because they're so different. And I'm like, why not? See, the problem is, if they were exactly the same, like if Matthew had copied Luke or vice versa, which they didn't, Spong would be suspicious of that. Well, now they're colluding. See, the problem is not the accounts. The problem is Spong. He was just suspicious of the whole thing, and however it was done, he was suspicious. But here's his problem. What he's saying is, wait a minute, Luke tells us that the angel Gabriel comes and talks to Mary and says, you're going to give birth to Messiah, even though you're a virgin. Then Matthew tells us that when Joseph finds out about Mary, he's going to divorce her, and the angel Gabriel appears to Joseph and says, no, you need to marry her. And so Spong is going, well, wait a minute. Luke says Gabriel appeared to Mary, but Matthew says Gabriel appeared to Joseph. Well, which is it? See, Spong thinks there's a written rule somewhere that says Gabriel isn't allowed to talk to two people. See, the fact is, folks, the Christmas stories that we read in Luke and Matthew are very different to each other, but they're not contradictory. They're complementary. They complement each other. They choose to focus on different angles. They choose to zero in on different characters, and together they give us this beautiful story of the coming of Jesus. I love the way one of my favorite theologians at the moment is a British woman by the name of Rebecca McLaughlin. I love how she terms this. She says the four Gospels together function like a beautiful string quartet. One instrument alone can be hauntingly beautiful, but the combined effort is even more stunning. Isn't that beautiful? And that's what we read. When we read the Christmas story, friends, in Luke and Matthew, we are hearing this beautiful duet that invites us to come and adore him. Because it's true. This story is true. And we can believe it. See, the irony is that the vast majority of scholars on the New Testament, whether they're conservative and agree with what I'm saying today, or whether they're rank liberal like Spong, the vast majority believe Mark was written first, and then Luke and Matthew probably both had the Gospel of Mark when they wrote. But Luke and Matthew probably didn't collaborate. They wrote independently of each other. But see, Bishop Spong, he focuses on how different they are. But if they don't collaborate, isn't it remarkable? They both say that the name of the mother is Mary. They both say she was a virgin. They both say the earthly adoptive father is Joseph. They both say that the child's name will be Jesus. They both say the angel Gabriel appeared and brought the message. And by the way, Bishop Spong, they both say he was born in Bethlehem. Now, if they aren't collaborating, isn't that remarkable? See, in my opinion, friends, as we finish, we don't have a conflicting report problem. We don't have a father time problem. We don't have a telephone game problem. We don't have a conflicting report problem. Because I think the Christmas story is history. It's reality. It's fact. Jesus really was born in Bethlehem of a virgin, announced by angels, visited by shepherds and magi. Can we prove that the Christmas story is true for every skeptic in the world? No. But there is strong evidence to believe that we can trust what has been written and passed down to us from eyewitnesses who have passed down and given to us real historical truth. Here's the bottom line today, friends. This is the key idea. The Christmas story is not fake news. The Christmas story is good news. In fact, it's the greatest news of all. I love the way, and I want to finish with these words this morning. I love the way that the angels announced to the shepherds in Luke's gospel the arrival of Messiah. Luke chapter 2, verse 10, the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people, because today in the town of David, in Bethlehem, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Lord. And this will be the sign for you. You'll find the baby wrapped in clothes, lying in a manger." Friends, that is not fake news. That's good news. That's true news. And that is the best news we can hear this season. So, Lord Jesus, we bow before you today and we thank you that you really did come. You really were born. God in human flesh. And you stepped into our world because of how deeply you love each of us. You stepped into our world to reveal the Father to us. And you stepped into our world to deal with our sin and wickedness. Thank you that you came, Lord Jesus. Thank you that you died for us and rose again, and you are coming again to reign forever as King of Kings. And thank you that this beautiful story we celebrate this season, it's not fake. It's true and it's good. And we worship you because of it today. Amen.